The fluorescent lights hummed their endless, nauseating song. Oak Creek Memorial's Trauma Observation Unit buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Friday night, ambulance sirens, monitor beeps, the rhythmic wheeze of ventilators keeping people alive who probably wanted to die. Natalie Hayes moved through it all like smoke, invisible the way she'd trained herself to be invisible, the way 5 years of quiet shifts had made her a ghost in scrubs. Nobody looked at her. Nobody asked her name. That was precisely the point. She'd rebuilt her life one shift at a time in these corridors. The shrapnel scar on her left shoulder had long since faded to a pale white line beneath her scrubs where no supervisor would ever think to ask questions. The muscle memory in her hands, the kind of memory that only came from holding dying soldiers in the dark, she kept that buried deep. Deeper still was everything before, the decorated rank she'd earned and lost, the court-martial that had shattered her career like a windshield hit at speed, the grief of James that still woke her at 3 a.m. Out here, pushing a cart of patient belongings through the sterile hallways of Oak Creek, Natalie Hayes was just a nurse. Just competent enough. Just invisible enough. Just wounded enough that nobody expected anything from her except steady hands and a closed mouth. The trauma bay door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying an unconscious man, maybe mid-50s, his left leg wrapped in an emergency tourniquet, abrasions across his exposed chest where the highway had shredded him. Highway accident. Solo vehicle. Found in a ditch 3 miles outside the city. No identification on the body. No wallet. No insurance card. No name. Natalie was assigned to catalogue his effects. Standard protocol. She pulled on fresh gloves, the latex snapping like a gunshot in the relative silence of the supply room, and began laying out the contents of his pockets on a stainless steel table that reflected the overhead lights like ice. A house key with no tag. $47 in cash. A wedding ring, gold, worn smooth from decades of contact with living skin. A torn leather jacket, the kind made from material so old and expensive it had become soft as butter. She was examining the jacket's interior lining when her breath caught. There, sewn with precision into the fabric like a badge of honor hidden from the world, was a patch. Faded. Worn. But unmistakable. The distinctive red and gold scroll of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Below it, stitched with the same careful military exactitude, coordinates and a date, helm and province. 2018. Natalie's hands went still. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to intensify. The air conditioning clicked on, forcing cold sterile air across her skin. She stared at the patch, her gloved fingers hovering above it but not touching, as if proximity alone might burn her. Muscle memory lived in her hands, in the tendons, the bone, the scar tissue from fragments that the surgeons had removed piece by piece over 6 months of recovery. Those hands had held rappel lines. Had loaded magazines. Had written after-action reports that no one had wanted to read. Had shaken after the court-martial, though she'd willed them not to. Those hands were trembling now. She forced them steady and continued cataloguing. Wedding ring. House key. Cash. Jacket with the patch sewn inside. Everything placed in a clear evidence bag with clinical precision. But her eyes kept returning to that patch. To the coordinates. To the year that had broken her life into before and after. She looked up through the ICU observation window. The patient's face was visible from this angle, profile turned away, left side swollen from impact trauma, but the bone structure unmistakable. The sharp angle of the jaw. The distinctive line of the nose. The way his hair had gone silver at the temples. She'd seen that face once before, 5 years ago, sitting across from her in a military courtroom. Seen it pass judgment. Seen it sign the paperwork that had ended her career as an officer and reduced her to a discharge with medical complications and a pension she had to fight for every 6 months. Colonel Marcus Vance. The recognition hit her like shrapnel, like the moment the IED had detonated 300 meters from her position in the Sanjin Valley. Like the moment the medevac Black Hawk had landed and hands had pulled her aboard and she'd realized that 12 Rangers were still on the ground and she was leaving them. Leaving them. The court-martial had been his way of ensuring nobody asked questions about how that extraction order had come down from higher command. How Vance had prioritized his own operational cover over the safety of personnel in the field. She'd disobeyed the retreat order. She'd pulled 12 Rangers out of a kill zone that would have turned into a massacre. The military had called it insubordination. Vance had called it a violation of the chain of command that required professional consequences. The court-martial had called it grounds for medical discharge. Her hands had earned her a Silver Star for valor and a Purple Heart for the shrapnel. Her disobedience had cost her the uniform. 5 years of pushing a cart through hospital corridors had been her penance for choosing people over protocol. The combat infantry badge fell from the jacket pocket before she could stop it, gravity and a loose seam conspiring in a single moment that felt like time slowing down. It clattered onto the stainless steel table with a sound like a bell, like a warning, like the first round fired in an ambush. Natalie caught it before it could roll. Her palm closed around the metal, still warm from the jacket, still bearing the weight of the man who had earned it under fire. She set it carefully on the evidence log, documented it with a hand that had learned, through 5 years of invisible practice, how to move without revealing what the movement cost her. When she looked up again, Dr. Gerald Ashford was standing outside the supply room window. He was watching her through the glass with an expression that made the temperature in the room drop 15 degrees. Not concern. Not professional curiosity. His eyes held the look of a man who had just watched another man's cards being dealt, who understood the hand being played, who knew exactly what needed to stay hidden and what needed to be buried. He'd already been in the trauma bay. That much was clear from the way he stood. He'd already seen the patient. He'd already been close enough to notice details that only someone trained to recognize them would catch. Close enough to see the 75th Ranger Regiment patch when it was accessible. Close enough to know that the unconscious man on the stretcher was someone important. Someone whose treatment or presence in this hospital meant something. And now he'd watched Natalie Hayes recognize him. She'd seen that look before, on the faces of men with secrets that needed protecting, on the faces of officers who understood that a single mistake, a single witness, a single moment of recognition could unravel everything they'd constructed. The look said, "I know who you are. I know what you know. And we both understand what needs to happen now." Natalie finished cataloguing the effects with methodical precision. Every item documented. Every piece of evidence properly logged. The badge went into the bag last, that small, heavy weight of metal that represented a man's service and a war that had left both of them scarred in ways the hospital's fluorescent lights would never illuminate. She closed the bag. Sealed it. Labeled it with the patient's hospital ID number, since he had no name yet, no history that the intake forms could verify, no past that mattered to the algorithms that determined insurance coverage and treatment protocol. When she looked back through the window, Dr. Ashford was still there. Still watching. Still holding her eyes with the kind of focus that said this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant moment of recognition, had changed something fundamental in the calculus between them. He raised his hand, a gesture that might have been a wave, might have been a warning, might have been simply a man acknowledging that he understood exactly what she'd just realized, that her 5 years of invisible healing in this hospital had just ended. That the past never really stayed buried. That Colonel Marcus Vance had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, and with him came every secret, every question, every carefully hidden truth that Natalie had spent 60 months learning how to carry in silence. The reprimand appeared on the unit board at 6 in the morning, exactly when the day shift arrived for their briefing. Natalie wasn't there to see it, but she heard about it before she finished her coffee in the break room. 3 hours post-admission. 3 hours since Ashford had watched her through the window with that expression, the look of a man who'd seen a connection form and understood immediately that it was a threat. The typed notice was formal, clinical, devastating, Nurse Hayes, improper handling of patient belongings, violation of protocol for point 7, failure to maintain chain of custody documentation. Formal warning issued. His signature was pristine. Expensive pen. The kind of signature a man practices because he knows it will appear on important documents. It was positioned directly above the shift change announcements, where 40 staff members gathered every morning at 7. Where the unit secretary would point it out. where people would read it, process it, and form opinions. Natalie saw it when she came in for the evening shift. Didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge it. But she felt the weight of it pressing against her ribs like a physical thing. She'd learned in Helm and Province that shame was a weapon. Wielded correctly, it could be more effective than threats. Ashford was competent. He wasn't just cruel, he was methodical. He was building architecture, not just throwing punches. By the next morning, Vance's daughter had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial. Her name was Sarah, 32, with her father's jaw and eyes that carried the particular exhaustion of someone sitting vigil over a parent. She stood in the ICU waiting room clutching a coffee she wasn't drinking, asking the unit coordinator questions nobody could answer yet because the patient was still sedated, still on the ventilator, still a question mark suspended between recovery and something worse. Ashford materialized at the exact moment Natalie was checking Vance's for placement and documenting his oxygen saturation. The door opened with that soft pneumatic sigh, the sound of someone entering a hospital room, the air displacement that happened 1,000 times a day and meant nothing until it meant everything. His voice came first, before his presence fully registered. Warm. Concerned. The voice of a doctor who cared deeply about patient safety and the well-being of his staff. Nurse Hayes, I'm worried about you. The words landed like a tactical strike. Public. Witnessed by the daughter. Positioned as concern rather than accusation, which made it more dangerous. Natalie's hands continued moving, steady, precise, because stopping would mean acknowledging the attack, and acknowledgement was surrender. This is the third time this week you've seemed confused. He paused, letting the word hang in the recycled air of the ICU. Stressed. Are you sleeping? Because patient safety depends on clear-headed staff, and if you're not mentally present, another pause. Perfectly timed. A conductor's gesture with words. Maybe you need some time off. For everyone's protection. Sarah's eyes widened. She was watching Natalie now with the look of someone who'd just learned the person checking her father's vital signs might be unstable, might be dangerous, might be the reason her father didn't wake up. It was execution-level humiliation. Not screaming. Not anger. Just the systematic destruction of credibility delivered with manufactured warmth. Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take in field hospitals under fire, the kind that came from places that still held muscle memory of staying alive when everything wanted to kill you. One tear escaped. Just one. Precise as a sniper's shot. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. I understand perfectly, Doctor. The tone was measured. Controlled. The accent of someone who'd swallowed something sharp and refused to let it cut on the way down. Her voice had dropped an octave, not dramatically, but enough that anyone listening would have heard something different underneath the servitude. Something that didn't match the tears. Ashford's expression didn't change. The mask held. But something flickered in his eyes, a microsecond of recognition that the attack hadn't landed the way he'd planned. Sarah looked away, uncertain. The moment had shifted. Natalie returned to the 4-pump, documenting the flow rate with the calm precision of someone who'd absorbed the blow and kept functioning, which was somehow more devastating than if she'd broken down completely. That afternoon, Natalie sat in the break room with her lunch, a salad she wasn't hungry for, a bottle of water, the small rituals of normalcy that meant she was still part of the hospital ecosystem. Within 30 seconds of her sitting down, 4 nurses stood simultaneously. Not dramatically. Not looking at her. They simply gathered their things, their own lunches, their phones, their attention, and moved to different tables, leaving her alone in a room full of occupied chairs. The silence was the kind that couldn't be accidental. It was orchestrated. It was the sound of professional ostracism, delivered without a word. By Friday, the machinery had turned fully. A memo appeared in her personnel file, permanent reassignment to night shift rotation, effective immediately. Staffing adjustment, see HR for details. No explanation. No consultation. No warning. Just a change in the system that moved her from the daylight hours where her reputation had been built, away from the colleagues who might defend her, into the graveyard shift where she'd work alone with a skeleton crew, and exhaustion that made everything feel worse. Her access badge, the plastic rectangle that had opened every door at Oak Creek Memorial for 18 months, no longer opened the ICU. She swiped it at Vance's door on Friday evening, and the magnetic lock didn't release. Tried again. A red light. An electronic refusal. IT said it was a system error when she called, something about a corrupted database, but the error only affected her access to that one room. Linda, the senior charge nurse who defended Natalie during a staff meeting, was reassigned to the pediatric floor on Thursday without explanation. Not fired. Not demoted. Just moved, relocated, removed from proximity to Natalie like a chess piece taken off the board before it could protect the king. Natalie heard Ashford on the phone through his office door on Friday afternoon. The door was open just enough for words to travel, which meant it was open intentionally. She was walking past with medication carts, and his voice carried, "I'm concerned about her mental state, signs of instability, fourth shift error in as many weeks, patient safety is my primary concern. I'll be documenting everything going forward. I appreciate your discretion on this matter." She understood the architecture now. He was building a paper trail. Each element, the public reprimand, the confrontation in Vance's room, the reassignment, the access restriction, the calls to administration, each one a brick in a wall designed to isolate her before she could piece together why a civilian physician was so desperate to control an Army Ranger's care, why he'd felt the need to see her face when he learned who Vance was, why recognition was a threat that required immediate containment. He needed her gone. Not fired, which might trigger legal questions. Just systematically removed from any position where she could ask questions, gather information, or connect dots that would expose whatever he was protecting. The break room felt colder on Friday night, the first night of her new permanent shift. The machines hummed their electric song, the refrigerator, the fluorescent panels overhead casting their pale institutional light. She was alone, which was the point. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment where everything shifted on its axis, where the careful architecture of Ashford's plan revealed its fatal flaw. That would come later, in the darkness of the fourth night shift, when systems began to fail in ways he couldn't control. The fourth night shift began like all the others since Ashford had moved her to the graveyard rotation, alone. Natalie pushed the med cart down the corridor of Oak Creek Memorial's cardiac wing, her scrubs still creased from the locker where she'd folded them 3 hours ago, waiting for the city to sleep and the fluorescent lights to feel less like surveillance. The hallway stretched in both directions, empty except for the hum of machines behind closed doors. She rolled past the nursing station where Marcus Vance's chart sat on the counter, the one she no longer had authorization to access directly. Restricted access. Pending investigation. The words printed on her badge update felt like a collar. She slowed as she passed his room. The door was halfway open. She could see the edge of his hospital bed, the 4 lines catching the pale glow from the monitors. Protocol demanded she keep walking. Her suspension paperwork had been explicit: no direct patient contact, observation only, security escort required for any documentation updates. The write-up from this morning was still posted on the unit board in the break room, printed in hospital-issued courier font like a wanted poster: Nurse Hayes, practicing beyond scope of license, patient endangerment, emergency review board scheduled. She'd read it twice before anyone noticed her standing there. But bodies don't follow paperwork. Natalie's eyes moved across Vance's vitals from the hallway monitor mounted outside his door, the small screen glowing against the darkened wall. Oxygen saturation 96%. Heart rate 78. Blood pressure stable at 118/74. The numbers looked like a man sleeping off anesthesia, recovering from a highway trauma that the initial CT scans had cleared for conservative management. No internal bleeding. No organ damage. No reason for the tightness she felt in her chest as she watched the numbers. She counted the time since his admission: 43 hours. Highway accident, blunt force trauma to the left anterior chest, bilateral contusions, but the doctors had called it a miracle. Lucky. The word hung in the hospital air like something that could be trusted. At 2:14 a.m., the oxygen saturation began to drop. It wasn't dramatic. No alarm bells. Just a slow migration downward, 96, then 94, then 92. Natalie was in the supply room restocking the crash cart, a task Ashford had reassigned to her on purpose, knowing it would keep her occupied and away from patient floors during the critical hours. She'd learned to time her supply runs during the hours when the monitors were quietest, when the skeleton crew of night nurses focused on paperwork and coffee. She was reaching for a box of 14-gauge angiocath needles when she heard it, the subtle shift in the rhythm of beeps from Vance's room 2 floors below. Not an alarm yet. Just a change in pitch. A tone that meant something was happening. Her hands went still on the needle box. She'd spent 5 years teaching herself not to hear that sound. 5 years in civilian nursing, muting the part of her brain that could read vital signs like a language. But the sound was in her blood. O2 sat dropping meant lungs weren't inflating right. Heart rate climbing meant the body was compensating. And if those two things were happening together, 43 hours after blunt chest trauma, it meant something catastrophic was developing inside a chest cavity that the radiologists had declared safe. Natalie was down the stairwell in 7 seconds flat. The monitor outside Vance's room now read 88%. Heart rate 104. Respirations climbing, 22, 24, 26. His chest was moving in a way that made the muscles between his ribs pull inward with each breath, retractions. The sign of a body fighting for air. She could see him through the doorway window, his face still peaceful in sleep, unaware that his autonomic nervous system was losing its war with whatever was developing inside. She pushed into his room. The respiratory tech, a kid named Marcus who couldn't have been more than 23, was standing at the foot of the bed staring at the monitor like it had suddenly started speaking Spanish. His hands were at his sides. His mouth was open slightly. The look of someone watching a disaster happen in slow motion and discovering he had no limbs. "Call for code team," Natalie said. Not a request. Statement. Command structure. The voice that had directed medic work under artillery fire. What? I or the doctor? 7 minutes out from this hospital. That gives us 7 minutes to keep this man's lungs inflating. Call it. Now. Marcus moved. His hand went to the wall phone like it was magnetized. Natalie's eyes swept the room for what she could use. For stand, saline drip, the meal tray Vance hadn't touched, plastic packaging still sealed around cold turkey and congealed gravy. She moved to his bedside. His oxygen sat was now 85%. His skin had taken on the grey-blue undertone that came from cells not getting enough oxygen, the color that looked like a body remembering death. She understood immediately what was happening. Pneumothorax. Delayed pneumothorax from internal trauma that the initial chest X-ray had missed, maybe a small pleural tear that had taken 43 hours to rupture under normal breathing, normal movement. Air was leaking from his lungs into the space between his lung and his chest wall. Every breath he took, more air leaked in, compressing the lung, pushing his heart over, making it harder for the remaining lung to expand. The body's compensation mechanism, breathing faster, heart beating harder, was making it worse. Without intervention in the next few minutes, his blood pressure would follow, his heart would start losing perfusion, and then it would be a room full of doctors running a code on a body that was already halfway gone. She tore open the plastic packaging from his meal tray. The rigid, sterile edges caught the overhead light. She grabbed gloves from the wall dispenser, latex, double-gloved, moving with the precision of muscle memory she'd sworn she'd buried with James in Arlington Cemetery 5 years ago. She was already moving her hands across Vance's chest, locating the landmarks, finding the space where the air was leaking out of his damaged lung. "Hold this," she said to Marcus. She pressed the plastic packaging against the lower left side of Vance's chest, her gloved hands creating a seal that would allow air to escape but not re-enter. An improvised flutter valve. Field medicine. Combat trauma protocol that belonged in Kandahar, not in a Houston hospital in the middle of the night. "Don't let air in," she told him, and her voice had become something different, flat, immediate, the tone that had no room for fear. Watch his chest rise. If you feel the packaging pull in, you've lost the seal. Tell me. Marcus's hands were shaking, but his fingers found the pressure point she'd indicated. She tilted Vance's head back slightly, opening the airway, her two fingers finding his carotid artery. The pulse was there but weak, racing, 112 beats per minute. His body was screaming. She monitored the monitor with one eye and Vance's chest movement with the other. 90 seconds. No alarms yet. The world had narrowed to a 40-inch monitor screen and a man's breathing. His oxygen sat read 84%. She adjusted the seal slightly, felt the resistance change, watched the graph line on the monitor make its subtle climb, 86%. Then 88. She could hear his lungs starting to inflate normally, the retractions easing, his body beginning to recognize that air was moving again. Stay exactly here, she said to Marcus. Pressure constant. Don't move. The code team arrived at minute 6, 7 minutes out had been optimistic, but close enough. They came through the door with the controlled chaos of people who'd done this 1,000 times, lead physician first, 2 nurses flanking, crash cart clattering behind. The lead physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, the one who had actual clinical sense, took in the scene in 2 seconds, the improvised plastic chest seal, the sealed 4, the monitor showing oxygenation climbing, the patient who should have been crashing but wasn't. She looked at Natalie. Who did this? Chen said. Not a challenge. Pure medical curiosity. This is field medicine. This is combat trauma protocol. Natalie was already backing toward the door. The code team was taking over now, moving into their own procedures. They'd get him upstairs to radiology to confirm the pneumothorax. They'd probably end up with a chest tube, but he'd be conscious for it. He'd be alive for it. The backup had worked. The seal had held. She was in the hallway when she heard Chen's voice again, lower this time, directed at her nurses. Get me her name. Get me whatever paperwork she filed tonight. This didn't happen. But it had. By 6:19 a.m., the formal write-up was already posted on the unit board. The font looked identical to the morning's previous humiliation, same courier print, same hospital letterhead. Nurse Natalie Hayes, practicing beyond scope of license, patient endangerment, unauthorized medical intervention, direct violation of current restrictions. Emergency Review Board convened 8:13 a.m. Pending investigation. Do not enter restricted areas. Do not provide direct patient care. Building access suspended. Ashford called an all-staff meeting at 7:15 a.m. The break room filled with morning shift nurses, the ones who'd watched her get moved to nights, watched her get reassigned to supply closets, watched the unit slowly turn away from her like a flower turning from shade. Ashford stood at the front of the room with printouts in his hands. 3 of them. He'd been busy. The clipboard he'd created over 2 weeks of careful moves, every moment of friction, every instance where she'd hesitated, every instance where she'd succeeded against his sabotage, now reframed as evidence of instability. I want to address this morning's incident, Ashford said, and his voice carried the tone of a man performing concern for an audience. Nurse Hayes took it upon herself to exceed her scope of practice in a way that could have compromised patient safety. I understand her intentions came from a good place, but in healthcare, good intentions don't matter. Protocol matters. The chain of command matters. And when a staff member begins making independent clinical decisions without authorization. He kept talking. Natalie stood at the back of the room with her badge in her pocket and her hands at her sides, watching the 3 nurses he'd aligned with himself, 2 from administration, 1 who'd worked with him at his previous hospital, nod at all the right moments. She counted the people who didn't make eye contact with her. 8. 12. All of them. The room had become a space where looking at her was like looking at a person who'd already died. A formal suspension has been issued, Ashford continued. Effective immediately, pending an administrative review. A security escort will be present when she retrieves her personal belongings. I want to be clear, we all want what's best for Natalie. Sometimes that means stepping back from situations that are beyond our capability to handle. Capability. The word hung in the break room air like something that could be weaponized. She left the room before he finished. Before anyone could offer sympathy they didn't mean. Before she had to watch the choreography of professional concern that was really just the sound of a door closing behind her. The security escort met her at her locker at 8:13 a.m. A guard named Peterson who'd worked hospital security for 7 years and who kept his eyes fixed on the far wall while she pulled down her belongings, a photo of James in his dress uniform, a backup stethoscope she'd carried since nursing school, the paperback novel she'd been reading for 3 weeks and never turned past page 4. 43 hours of James's ring on her left hand glinted in the fluorescent overhead light. She was married to a ghost and divorced from everyone living. Peterson walked her to the employee exit. The morning was already hot, Houston in late summer, the asphalt radiating yesterday's heat. She stood in the parking lot holding a cardboard box of her own things and understood that she'd just watched a man methodically dismantle her second life with the same competence he'd probably used to build it. Ashford had created the perfect paper trail, evidence of instability, evidence of boundary violations, evidence that could be presented to a review board and would require her to prove a negative, that she wasn't unstable, wasn't reckless, wasn't a liability. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere inside a hospital room, Colonel Marcus Vance was waking up to a chest tube and the knowledge that a nurse he didn't remember had saved his life. And in 2 days, maybe 3, he'd be coherent enough to talk. Coherent enough to explain who'd touched his chest with hands that knew exactly where to put pressure. Coherent enough to recognize the woman who'd just been escorted out of the building. And Ashford would already be 2 moves ahead, already prepared for the story that Vance would tell, already positioned to explain why a suspended nurse with a history of instability might have a motivation to claim she'd saved a patient. Ashford, who'd seen the patch, who'd seen the badge, who understood exactly who Vance was and what he represented. Natalie sat in her car in the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot and understood that the rules had changed. Ashford wasn't trying to break her anymore. He was trying to erase her. And the only person who could stop that was waking up in a hospital bed upstairs, breathing through a tube, coming back to consciousness like a man remembering how to survive. The question was whether he'd remember her name. By morning, the write-up was already filed. Dr. Ashford had worked through the night, each keystroke measured, each sentence crafted with the precision of a man who understood how institutions protected themselves. Natalie Hayes, RN, had violated Protocol 47.3 of the Nursing Scope of Practice, Emergency Response Beyond Licensure. The words looked surgical. Clinical. Damning. He dated it to the exact minute of the code, listed witnesses he knew would stay quiet, referenced her prior instability concerns that conveniently appeared in his notes from the previous week. Paper trail. Foundation. Leverage. The kind of documentation that made firing someone look like patient protection, not retaliation. The emergency review board meeting was called for 8 a.m. sharp. Ashford sat in the administrator's office at 7:15, 3 board members already settled around the polished conference table like pieces in a game he'd been playing for months. These men owed him a research grant steered to Henderson's wife's nonprofit, a job placement for Pierce's nephew in IT, a quiet recommendation to credentials for Martinez's hospital when his malpractice suit needed burying. Favors weren't currency in this economy, they were chains. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His voice came soft, reasonable, the sound of genuine concern for patient safety. Major Hayes exceeded her scope. Improvised medical procedures during active crisis. The patient survived by luck, not competence. We can't have nurses practicing medicine in trauma bays. Sets a precedent. Henderson nodded. Pierce was already looking at his phone, checked out. Martinez took notes but didn't argue. Ashford watched their faces and saw yes in the slope of their shoulders. At 7:42 a.m., Natalie received the restricted access email. Building suspension, pending formal investigation. Her badge would no longer unlock the north entrance. Her credentials were flagged in the system. She stood in her kitchen holding her phone, reading the words a second time, then a third. Investigation pending. Conduct review. Patient safety protocols. The language was institutional armor. It meant she was already gone. They'd just decided when to announce it. Ashford's strategy unfolded like he'd choreographed it. By 8:13 a.m., after the board meeting concluded with the expected outcome, he was on the phone with human resources. By 9:15, her access codes were disabled. By 10 a.m., rumors were moving through the unit. She'd violated protocol, she'd acted unstable, she'd endangered a patient, possibly caused a crash that almost killed a ranger who was now the face of the hospital's trauma response. Each rumor had a fact underneath it. Each fact was technically true but contextually false. That was Ashford's genius. He didn't need to lie. He just needed to control which truths got told and which ones stayed buried. By noon, she wasn't allowed in the building. By 1 p.m., his colleague Dr. Reeves mentioned that maybe Natalie shouldn't be listed as primary nurse on any active cases pending investigation. By 3 p.m., the chief of nursing had reassigned her entire patient roster. By 5 p.m., her locker had been cleared by security, her personal items placed in a cardboard box, sitting at the front desk like evidence. The isolation was complete and total. No one would work shifts with her. No one could advocate for her. No one dared. Ashford had made sure of that. What he didn't understand was that his strategy, so carefully designed, had locked him into place. He couldn't stop pushing because stopping would be admission that she was dangerous, and if she was dangerous, someone should have noticed before. He couldn't back down because backing down meant the paper trail he'd created was weaponized harassment. So he kept moving forward, each motion designed to remove her before she connected the dots, before she understood that a civilian doctor had no reason to control a ranger's medical file unless that ranger knew something Ashford needed to stay hidden. That night, Natalie drove to Westwood Cemetery in northwest Houston, rain beginning to fall as she passed under the oak trees that gave the hospital its name. The irony didn't escape her. She parked near the granite section, walked through grass that was already soaked, her shoes dark with wet. The headstone was simple. No fancy lettering. Just the facts, Captain James Hayes. KIA Helmand Province 2019. Beloved husband. The rain started harder then, not a drizzle but a downpour, the kind that hammered the earth and made the living feel small. She knelt beside the stone. Her uniform scrubs darkened with water. Her hands were steady as she touched the engraved letters, tracing her husband's name with one finger. I failed again, Jamie. Her voice cracked on the words. First time it had broken in days. I saved the man who blamed me for your death. I saved him, and he's destroying me from a hospital bed without even knowing it. I disobeyed orders to save those 12 Rangers, and Vance court-martialed me for it because he couldn't admit that his tactical failure got you killed. That's what I carried. That's what I buried. And now I've pulled the same move again, saved his life, and I'm losing everything we sacrificed for. She pressed her forehead against the wet stone. Rain mixed with tears, impossible to separate one from the other. I don't know how to keep fighting, Jamie. I thought I was done fighting. I thought quiet was enough. I thought just being good at my job, just saving lives, just making it through each shift without breaking, I thought that was enough. The rain hammered down. She knelt there in it like a penitent, hands pressed flat against the earth over his grave, and said nothing more because there was nothing left to say. What she didn't know, what no one at Oak Creek Memorial knew, was that 1 hour earlier, in the ICU on the 3rd floor, Colonel Marcus Vance's sedation had lifted just enough for conscious thought. His eyes opened slowly, the world blurring, then focusing. The ventilator hissed its rhythm into his lungs. Fluorescent lights cast everything in white-blue. His daughter was asleep in the chair beside him, her head tilted at an angle that would make her neck scream when she woke. Monitors beeped. Machines breathed for him. And in that space between sedation and awareness, fragments of memory assembled, the highway, the impact, the spin, the darkness. And then, hands. professional hands, moving with the kind of practiced certainty that belonged to someone who'd done this before. A voice, giving orders. A woman's voice. A voice that carried authority like it wore a rank. A voice that had saved his life while his own body betrayed him. He hit the call button. The night supervisor came, a young man with the tired eyes of someone working his fourth consecutive 12-hour shift. Vance's throat was raw from intubation, his voice barely a whisper, but the words came clear, the nurse who saved me during the code. The one who did the emergency procedure. What was her name? The supervisor checked the incident report on the wall-mounted monitor. Natalie Hayes. She's not assigned to your case anymore, sir. There's an investigation into. Get her. Vance's voice didn't rise, but the command in it made the supervisor straighten. Now. I need to talk to her. The supervisor explained about the suspension, the restricted access, the building lockout. Vance's face went pale, not from pain, but from understanding. He asked for his daughter, asked her to retrieve a specific file from military archives, a file that had been classified until 3 years ago, a file that he'd carried guilt over for 5 years because it proved everything he'd never said. His daughter nodded and left without questions. She'd learned a long time ago that when her father moved, people listened. Meanwhile, in his office 2 floors below, Dr. Ashford was deleting digital records. His fingers moved across the keyboard with steady precision. Timestamp alterations. Access logs rewritten. His own entries to Vance's room removed from the system entirely. The IT security monitoring he'd bypassed 3 weeks ago with a purchased credential wouldn't catch him. He'd used an off-network device, routed through an external drive. He was meticulous. He was careful. He was the kind of man who understood that the future belonged to those who could control the narrative, and the narrative was written in files and documentation and the permanent record. He was on the phone now, the hospital board chair on the line, his voice smooth and reasonable and genuinely concerned. The Hayes situation is unfortunate. She was a dedicated nurse. But her mental state prior to the emergency, the obvious instability, and now this clear violation of scope. We have no choice. Patient safety must come first. We suspend her effective immediately pending formal termination proceedings. What Ashford didn't see, what he couldn't see because he'd been too focused on moving pieces inside the hospital, was the federal agent sitting in a grey sedan across the parking lot, watching him through the office window, a telephoto lens capturing every gesture, every keystroke recorded by monitoring software installed 3 weeks ago when the FBI had begun quietly investigating how a civilian doctor at Oak Creek Memorial had begun accumulating suspicious payments from pharmaceutical companies. $17,000 a month in cash. $500,000 a year in consulting fees from 3 different drug manufacturers. Patient information flowing outward. Research data that shouldn't have been shared. Clinical trial enrollment records for medications he'd never prescribed. The FBI had been patient. They'd been thorough. And they'd been waiting for Dr. Ashford to commit a federal crime on camera, which he was doing right now, with every keystroke, every deleted file, every altered record designed to obstruct what would become a witness-tampering investigation. When you were destroying evidence to protect yourself, you were confessing that there was something worth protecting. The agent took another photograph. Then another. Her hand steady on the camera. Waiting for the moment to move. But that moment hadn't come yet. Not while Natalie knelt in the rain, not while Vance's daughter drove toward the military archives, not while Ashford convinced himself that he'd already won. The silence held for a few more hours. The waiting had one more night. And somewhere in the hospital, the truth was waking up, piece by piece, memory by memory, as Colonel Marcus Vance lay in his ICU bed and began to remember the name of the woman who'd saved his life and destroyed his carefully constructed cover story in the same moment. The conference room at Oak Creek Memorial had 12 chairs, and Dr. Ashford occupied the one nearest power, right hand of the CEO, flanked by board members whose names appeared on his dinner receipts and whose daughters had benefited from scholarships he'd quietly funded. The kind of allies you buy slowly, carefully, with the understanding that favors compound like interest. He'd prepared for this. The documentation was airtight. 3 performance complaints. Restricted access logs. A clean paper trail showing Major Hayes, though they didn't call her Major here, and that was the whole strategy, becoming increasingly unstable, erratic, unreliable. He had rehearsed his expression, concern masked as professional duty. The trembling hand. The reluctant recommendation that she surrender her credentials voluntarily. He knew how these things worked. The door opened and Natalie Hayes entered in scrub still damp from the morning shift, and she saw immediately what had changed. Not the faces. The presence. The silence that comes before a verdict. She'd heard that silence in Helmand Province, in debriefing rooms where officers made decisions that would haunt younger soldiers for the rest of their lives. But what stopped her cold, what made her hands go still and her breathing shallow, was the wheelchair. The figure sitting in it. The combat infantry badge pinned to a hospital gown. Colonel Marcus Vance's eyes opened, found hers across the boardroom table, and the world compressed into a single word whispered through damaged lungs. Phoenix. That name. That call sign. That voice speaking it like resurrection and indictment and mercy all at once. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She stood in the doorway like a soldier receiving fire, absorbing the impact without flinching, because flinching was the moment you died, not physically, but in every way that mattered. Phoenix. The designation she'd carried in Helmand, the name the men under her command had used when they needed her to make impossible choices. The name she'd buried so completely that hearing it aloud felt like hearing a ghost pronounce its own name. Vance's daughter stood, her voice shaking. My father says you hold the rank of major. That you served in his unit. That you, she stopped, emotion catching in her throat, and looked at a folder in her hands. That you've been working here as a nurse for 5 years while everyone treated you like you were. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Natalie's hands trembled as she reached for the file the daughter extended. Not from fear. From the specific, calculated trembling of someone holding back a decade of restraint, 5 years of silence, 1,825 days of deferring to people who'd never seen combat, never made decisions where choosing wrong meant watching men die. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. Steady. Military. The mask had cracked. Medical discharge. 19 days after Helmand. Silver Star. Purple Heart. 2 counts. She paused, reading her own classified history in front of witnesses, reading the official summary of why she'd been sent home and told never to speak of what happened. Recommended for DSC. Court-martialed for disobeying direct retreat orders instead. The room went silent. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've been standing next to someone they fundamentally misunderstood, when every dismissive comment, every glance, every time they'd called her just a nurse suddenly transformed into something approaching criminal negligence. Ashford's jaw clenched. The CEO leaned back in his chair like the weight of the moment had physically pushed him. The board members exchanged glances that said they understood, finally, that they'd been played. Colonel Vance's voice came through stronger now, clearer, the pain medication and rehab giving him back enough strength to speak the truth he'd been carrying since consciousness returned. Major Natalie Hayes earned a Silver Star and Purple Heart in Helmand Province after leading a rescue operation under fire. He paused, and Natalie heard the weight of accountability in that pause. I court-martialed her for disobeying orders to retreat. Orders that would have left 12 men to die. Orders I gave to cover my own tactical failure. I was wrong. And she's never said one word about it until now. Ashford's face cycled through colors, first red, then the specific grey-white of someone whose entire constructed reality is collapsing in real time. His mouth opened. Nothing came. His hands gripped the table edge like it was the only solid thing left in the room. And that's when the door at the back of the conference room opened and a woman in a dark suit stepped forward, badge clipped to her belt, laptop already in her hands. Dr. Ashford. Not a greeting. A pronouncement. I'm Special Agent Reeves with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ashford's head snapped toward her. His eyes dilated. The predator became prey in 3 words. "We've been investigating your activities for the last 3 months." Reeves placed the laptop on the conference table and opened it. The screen reflected in Ashford's face as she navigated files. HIPAA violations. Medical information sold to 3 pharmaceutical companies. We have your bank records. We have email correspondence. We have encrypted messaging logs discussing pricing structures for patient data. She turned the screen slightly. "Do you recognize your own handwriting?" July 14th, per patient, $500 to $2,000 depending on diagnosis severity and ongoing treatment plans. Ashford's hands were shaking now, real shaking, the kind that comes from panic, from realizing the walls are closing. "This is ridiculous. I was acting in the hospital's interest. Patient privacy. She was unstable. She needed to be removed before." "Before what?" Vance's voice cut through like a scalpel. "Before I woke up and told them you deliberately delayed the code response when my lungs collapsed. Before I mentioned the 3 separate times you altered my medication logs." Reeves continued, clinical, relentless. "When you discovered Colonel Vance's identity, you faced a problem. He's a federal witness in an ongoing Veterans Affairs fraud investigation, a case where your network of pharmaceutical contacts overlaps significantly with VA procurement officials. You needed to control his medical care, limit his interactions, prevent him from connecting dots. So when Major Hayes recognized him, when she recognized the unit patch and understood exactly what was happening, you initiated a systematic campaign to eliminate her credibility." Reeves clicked through surveillance footage. There was Ashford in his office, 11:36 p.m., fingers flying across his keyboard. Falsified performance reviews. Requested reassignments for anyone who might listen to her. Made calls to administration questioning her mental fitness. The CEO looked like he was going to be sick. Reeves wasn't finished. "The worst part about being caught in a conspiracy is that they always keep talking. Last night, Dr. Ashford accessed hospital systems and attempted to forge Major Hayes's personnel records. Deleted Colonel Vance's military medical files. Altered treatment logs to cover traces of his interference with a federal witness's care. We've documented 17 separate federal felonies committed in the last 72 hours. All of it recorded. All of it admissible." Ashford's voice when he finally spoke was hoarse, cracking. "I was protecting, I was concerned about her stability, she was practicing beyond." That's when the 2 federal agents entered from the side door. They'd been waiting. They always wait for the moment when the guilty person tries to construct one more lie, tries to find one more angle. That moment crystallizes everything. That moment is when juries lean forward. "Dr. Gerald Ashford, you're under arrest for violations of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and forgery of federal medical records. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The cuffs clicked. The sound of stainless steel and finality. Ashford's eyes found Natalie's across the room, desperate, pleading. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath soldiers take before choosing mercy or justice. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "I'm going on break." Dry, understated, the kind of thing someone says when everything has just been resolved with the precision of a surgical strike. Vance's daughter actually laughed, a shocked, relieved sound. Even the CEO managed something close to it. They walked Ashford out past the unit board where he'd posted her reprimand, past the break room where staff had stopped talking when she entered, past the ICU where he'd dressed her down in front of a patient's family while constructing his own empire of lies. The perp walk was silent except for footsteps and the soft metallic whisper of handcuffs and expensive shoes on linoleum. No one followed. No one watched. By the time they reached the elevator, he was already forgotten. 6 months later, the halls of Houston Veterans Affairs Medical Center rang with a different kind of quiet. The quiet of respect earned. Natalie wore a military liaison uniform now, dark blue with the Army insignia on her shoulder and her rank clearly visible for the first time in 5 years, Major. The shrapnel scar on her left shoulder, visible where the uniform sleeve met her collarbone, was no longer something to hide. It was a credential. It was a story. It was proof. She walked into Colonel Vance's recovery room where he sat by the window, physical therapy equipment stacked in the corner, his daughter visiting with 2 small grandchildren who were learning to climb on his lap despite the surgical scars and the lingering weakness. He looked up. Stood, moving slower than before but moving, that was the victory. That was what her hands had purchased with an improvised chest seal and field medicine that broke every protocol in the hospital manual. Major. His voice was different now. Respectful. Aware. Colonel. She nodded. The formality mattered. It was the way soldiers acknowledged each other across the divide of what they'd survived together. His daughter approached Natalie, took both her hands. He talks about you every day. About Helmand. About what you did. About what you've been doing here. Her eyes were wet. Thank you. Thank you for saving him. For not walking away when he was unconscious and couldn't defend himself or explain. Natalie's voice was quiet. I did what any medic would do. Then and now. Vance stood, moved slowly to her, extended his hand with the deliberation of someone whose body was still learning to trust itself. They shook hands and it meant something. It meant he understood. It meant 5 years of silence could finally become speech. I'm recommending your Silver Star be upgraded to Distinguished Service Cross. And I'm petitioning to have your court-martial expunged from the record. It won't bring back the years, but it's a start. Natalie shook his hand, steady, saw the weight he was still carrying, and said, Captain James Hayes would have wanted me to save you. So I did. His daughter was crying now. The grandchildren sensed something had shifted in the air and went quiet. Outside the window, Houston stretched out in afternoon heat, the city indifferent to the fact that someone in this room had carried the weight of impossible choices and had finally been seen. Across the city, in a strip mall between a check-cashing store and a vape shop, Dr. Gerald Ashford sat at a folding table with a laminated banner reading Affordable Supplemental Insurance. His medical license was revoked. His criminal trial was scheduled for next month. His assets were frozen pending restitution, $847,000 to the pharmaceutical companies whose information had been misdirected, $300,000 to the hospital. The empire of social manipulation and institutional power had collapsed in the time it took for a laptop to open and a federal agent to speak 3 sentences. He made cold calls from a script, voice hollow, making his way through a list of numbers that never answered and hung up immediately. The commission checks came in sporadic and small, enough to rent a studio apartment in the same Houston suburb where he'd once owned a 6-bedroom colonial. Enough to eat. Not enough to matter. His phone rang. Another rejection. He closed his eyes. Picked up the next number on the list. At the VA hospital, Natalie pinned a new badge to her uniform, Major N. Hayes, Combat Medicine Liaison. Her first patient of the day was a veteran in a wheelchair, spinal cord injury, learning again how to want things, how to hope for recovery. He looked up at her insignia, saw the ribbons, the Silver Star catching the light, the Purple Heart, the Combat Medical Badge, the Ranger tab, and asked the question that mattered. You served. She smiled, touched the Silver Star ribbon with the casualness of someone who no longer had to hide it. Still do. Just carry different tools now. Like and subscribe if you know someone like Major Hayes, someone who carries their service quietly, who heals without announcing it, who understands that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes instead of guns.